February 7, 1855. The Matagorda Peninsula stretches flat and windswept along the Texas Gulf Coast, a place where the sky meets the horizon in an unbroken line, and the salt air carries the bellow of longhorn cattle across prairie grass that grows waist-high in the wet season. In a modest dwelling near the water, a child is born to Antonio Siringo and his wife Bridget. The father, an Italian immigrant who crossed an ocean seeking fortune in a new land, holds his son Charles Angelo for what will be one of the few times in the boy's memory. Within a year, Antonio will be dead, leaving Bridget alone to raise Charles and his older sister Catherine in a landscape that shows no mercy to widows. The Matagorda Peninsula in the 1850s is not yet the romanticized frontier of dime novels. It is a place of physical labor, of cattle that must be branded and driven, of men who settle disputes with fists and occasionally with firearms, of economic opportunity built on the backs of those willing to endure discomfort for the promise of profit. Young Charles Siringo will absorb these realities the way other children absorb nursery rhymes, and they will shape everything that follows. What do you call someone who chased Billy the Kid through the deserts of New Mexico, hunted Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid across 2 continents, and transformed from a Texas cattle driver into one of the most legendary detectives in American history? The easy answer is to call him a gunfighter. But that term requires clarification. In the popular imagination, gunfighters were outlaws, men like Jesse James or Billy the Kid who operated outside the law and met violent ends. The historical reality was more complex. Gunfighters were ranchers defending their property, lawmen enforcing territorial statutes, outlaws evading capture, and bounty hunters pursuing rewards. They were products of a specific economic and legal environment where centralized authority was weak. Distances were vast, and the line between legal and extra-legal violence was often unclear. Among these categories, bounty hunters occupied the most fascinating position. They were neither fully inside nor outside the law. They pursued criminals for profit, operating with legal sanction but without official badges. And among bounty hunters, one name stands above the rest: Charles Angelo Siringo, the cowboy detective whose career spanned the final decades of the frontier era, and whose story reveals the truth behind the mythology of the Wild West. This is not a story of quick-draw duels at high noon or of righteous heroes gunning down irredeemable villains. It is the story of a man who lived through the transition from open range to barbed wire, from vigilante justice to corporate detective agencies, from a West defined by personal reputation to one governed by industrial capital. Siringo's life intersects with virtually every major figure and event of the late frontier period. He drove cattle up the Chisholm Trail when that route was at its peak. He was present in Dodge City during one of its most famous confrontations. He joined the Pinkerton Detective Agency at the height of its power and spent decades tracking criminals across distances that would be difficult to imagine today. He pursued Billy the Kid as a young ranch hand, then decades later published his own account of the chase. He spent 4 years hunting Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, covering 25,000 miles in the process. He protected labor attorney Clarence Darrow during a trial that exposed the tensions between capital and labor in the early 20th century. And when the Pinkerton Agency tried to suppress his memoirs, he fought back with a determination that eventually forced him into exile from entire states. The evidence for Siringo's life comes from multiple sources that create a complex and sometimes contradictory picture. His own writings provide the narrative backbone, but they must be read with the understanding that Siringo was crafting a public persona even as he documented his experiences. Agency records from Pinkerton confirm many of his cases but omit the personal details that make his memoirs compelling. Newspaper accounts from the period place him at specific locations and events, anchoring his stories to verifiable dates and places. Court documents reveal the legal battles he fought to tell his truth. What emerges is not a simple hero's journey, but a portrait of a man caught between competing loyalties, between the code of the frontier and the demands of corporate employers, between the mythology of the West and the often mundane reality of detective work. The promise of this account is to separate what we can document from what we merely believe, to show how one man's career illuminates the transformation of an entire region, and to understand why Charles Siringo's story matters beyond its inherent drama. This is a story about the death of one America and the birth of another, told through the life of a man who witnessed both. The Texas that Charles Siringo knew as a child was still raw from the Civil War and Reconstruction. The cattle industry that would define his early career was just beginning to take shape. Before the war, cattle in Texas had little commercial value. Longhorns roamed semi-wild across the state, marked but not necessarily controlled by the ranchers who claimed them. The war disrupted what limited market existed, and by 1865 an estimated 5 million cattle wandered Texas while the rest of the nation faced meat shortages. The solution was the cattle drive, moving Texas beef north to railheads in Kansas where the animals could be shipped east to urban markets. The Chisholm Trail, blazed by trader Jesse Chisholm in the 1860s, became the primary route. It ran from San Antonio north through Austin, across the Red River into Indian Territory, through what is now Oklahoma, and terminated at cattle towns like Abilene and Dodge City in Kansas. The trail covered roughly 800 miles and required 2 to 3 months to traverse. A typical drive involved 2,000 to 3,000 head of cattle and a crew of a dozen men. The mathematics of the cattle drive defined everything. Longhorns could walk 15 to 20 miles per day under good conditions. They needed to graze and water regularly, which meant the crew had to know the location of every river, creek, and watering hole along the route. They had to avoid stampedes triggered by thunderstorms, predators, or simple bovine panic. They had to prevent the herd from mixing with other cattle or being stolen by rustlers. They had to navigate relationships with Native American tribes whose land they crossed, sometimes paying tolls, sometimes defending the herd with weapons. A successful drive could net significant profit. Cattle bought for $3 or $4 per head in Texas might sell for $30 or $40 in Kansas. But success required skill, endurance, and luck in equal measure. Charles Siringo entered this world at age 12 when he began learning the basics of cow punching. By 15, he was working under Shanghai Pierce, a legendary cattleman whose real name was Abelhead Pierce and who claimed descent from Mayflower pilgrims. Pierce was known for his profanity, his business acumen, and his ability to move large herds efficiently. Under Pierce's tutelage, Siringo learned the practical skills that would serve him for the rest of his life. How to read terrain, how to anticipate trouble, how to lead men under difficult conditions. The cast of characters in Siringo's world extended beyond cattlemen and cowhands. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, was approximately 4 years younger than Siringo. By 1880, when Siringo first pursued him, the Kid had already earned a reputation as a rustler and killer in New Mexico Territory. The exact number of his victims is disputed, but contemporary sources suggest he killed 4 men, not the 21 claimed by later mythology. Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker in 1866, was 11 years Siringo's junior. He formed the Wild Bunch gang in the 1890s, specializing in bank and train robberies. His partner, Harry Longaball, known as the Sundance Kid, was born in 1867. Together they represented a new type of criminal, mobile, organized, and capable of evading capture for years. Wyatt Earp, born in 1848, was 7 years older than Siringo. He served as a lawman in Dodge City and later in Tombstone, Arizona, where he participated in the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in October 1881. Bat Masterson, born in 1853, was nearly Siringo's contemporary. He worked as a lawman in Dodge City alongside Earp and later became a sports writer in New York. These men were not characters in a fictional drama. They were products of specific economic and social conditions, and their paths crossed Siringo's at moments that reveal the true nature of frontier life. Charles Siringo's transformation from cowboy to detective began with experiences that would have broken lesser men. In 1876, at age 21, he successfully drove 2,500 Longhorn cattle from Austin, Texas to Kansas along the Chisholm Trail. The drive covered 800 miles and took approximately 2.5 months. The crew faced the standard challenges: river crossings, thunderstorms, potential stampedes, and negotiations with various parties who controlled land along the route. Siringo's role required him to manage men, make decisions under pressure, and deliver the herd intact. The mathematics of the drive reveal its scale. 2,500 head moving 15 miles per day, consuming grass and water, requiring constant supervision. One stampede could scatter the herd across miles of prairie. One mistake at a river crossing could drown dozens of animals. Siringo delivered his herd successfully, demonstrating the competence that would define his later career. The summer of 1877 brought Siringo to Dodge City during one of its most famous incidents. The town had earned a reputation as both a vital cattle market and a den of violence. Saloons, gambling hall, and brothels served cowboys who arrived after months on the trail with money to spend and energy to burn. Lawmen like Wyatt, Earp, and Masterson attempted to maintain order, though their methods were often as violent as the behavior they policed. On a day in 1877, the exact date is not recorded in surviving documents, a confrontation occurred involving Clay Allison, a notorious gunfighter and rancher. Allison had a reputation for violence fueled by alcohol, and his presence in Dodge City created tension. According to Wyatt Earp's later accounts, he confronted Allison and backed him down without firing a shot, using reputation and nerve alone. Siringo was present during this incident, and decades later he offered a different version. In his account, 2 anonymous businessmen intervened and diffused the situation before Earp became involved. This discrepancy matters not because one version is definitely correct, but because it reveals how frontier stories were constructed. Earp had reasons to embellish his role. He was building a legend that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Siringo had reasons to deflate that legend. He valued accuracy over mythology and was willing to contradict celebrated figures when his memory disagreed with their accounts. Siringo's first bounty hunting experience came in 1880, while he worked at the LX Ranch in the Texas Panhandle. Billy the Kid had been rustling cattle in New Mexico territory, and various parties were offering rewards for his capture. Siringo joined a posse that pursued the Kid through the deserts and mountains of New Mexico. The chase covered hundreds of miles over difficult terrain. The Kid was familiar with the landscape and had allies who provided him with food, shelter, and information. The posse lacked these advantages. They tracked him through the Guadalupe Mountains, across the Pecos River, through towns where he had friends and ranches where he had hidden before. The manhunt lasted weeks and ultimately proved unsuccessful. The Kid evaded capture, though he would be caught and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett the following year. For Siringo, the experience was formative. He learned the challenges of pursuit across vast distances, the importance of local knowledge, and the limitations of frontier justice. He also discovered that he had a talent for the work, a combination of patience, physical endurance, and strategic thinking that made him effective at tracking and capturing fugitives. By 1884, Siringo had married Mamie Lloyd and moved to Kansas to open a store. The attempt at settled life represented a break from his cowboy years, a gamble that domestic life and mercantile success could replace the uncertainty and adventure of cattle drives. The gamble failed. The store struggled financially, and within 2 years, Siringo was looking for new opportunities. In 1886, he made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He joined the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Founded by Allen Pinkerton in 1850, the agency had grown into the largest private law enforcement organization in the United States. It provided services that ranged from railroad security to strike-breaking, from tracking criminals to gathering intelligence on labor unions. The agency employed hundreds of detectives and operated offices across the country. Its motto, "We never sleep," and its symbol, an unblinking eye, conveyed both competence and a faintly sinister omnipresence. Siringo joined the Pinkerton Agency at a moment when the West was transitioning from frontier to settled region. Railroads now crossed the continent, connecting isolated towns to national markets. Telegraph lines allowed near instantaneous communication across thousands of miles. Barbed wire, invented in the 1870s, was transforming open range into fenced property. Territorial governments were becoming more organized, with established courts and law enforcement. In this changing environment, the Pinkerton Agency represented a new model of justice: professional, corporate, answerable to paying clients rather than to elected officials or local communities. Siringo became known as the Cowboy Detective, a nickname that acknowledged his frontier background while emphasizing his new role. His cowboy skills, his ability to ride long distances, to survive in harsh conditions, to read people and situations, translated effectively to detective work. His lack of formal education mattered less than his practical intelligence and his willingness to endure discomfort for extended periods. Over his 2 decades with the Pinkerton Agency, Siringo compiled more than 100 arrests. This figure, documented in agency records, represents a remarkable level of productivity. Each arrest required investigation, pursuit, and capture. Some cases were resolved quickly. Others consumed months or years. Siringo worked undercover, adopting false identities and infiltrating criminal organizations. He tracked fugitives across multiple states and territories. He testified in court, providing evidence that led to convictions. His name became known at Pinkerton outposts throughout the West, and his success rate made him one of the agency's most valued operatives. The work required skills beyond physical courage. Siringo had to be a convincing actor, able to maintain false identities under scrutiny. He had to be patient, willing to spend weeks gathering evidence before making a move. He had to be strategic, understanding when to confront criminals and when to continue surveillance. And he had to navigate the ethical complexities of working for an agency that served corporate interests, sometimes at the expense of workers and small landowners. The biggest assignment of Siringo's career began in 1899 when the Pinkerton Agency tasked him with hunting Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, leaders of the Wild Bunch gang. The Wild Bunch had been robbing banks and trains throughout the West for several years, and by the late 1890s they had become the most wanted outlaws in the region. Cassidy and Sundance were not the crude desperados of popular imagination. They planned their robberies carefully, studied railroad schedules and bank procedures, and escaped along routes they had scouted in advance. They surrounded themselves with competent associates, including Harvey Logan, known as Kid Curry, and Ben Kilpatrick, called the Tall Texan. The gang operated primarily in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Nevada, moving between hideouts in remote areas where lawmen struggled to pursue them. The Pinkerton Agency's interest in the Wild Bunch was driven by client needs. Railroads and banks were losing significant money to the gang's activities, and they hired Pinkerton to solve the problem. Siringo's assignment lasted 4 years, from 1899 to 1903. During that time, he traveled over 25,000 miles across multiple countries and 2 continents. The scale of this pursuit is difficult to comprehend. 25,000 miles in the early 20th century meant weeks aboard trains, days on horseback, nights in uncomfortable hotels or sleeping rough. It meant crossing the Rocky Mountains multiple times, riding through deserts, navigating cities where he had no contacts. Siringo used multiple aliases: Tony Lloyd, Harry Blevins, and Charles L. Carter, described as a runaway Mexican outlaw. Each identity required its own backstory, its own mannerisms, its own explanation for why Siringo was asking questions or appearing in particular places. He worked alongside Tom Horn, a former Pinkerton detective who had become a hired gun for cattle interests in Wyoming. Horn's reputation for violence provided cover for Siringo's investigations, though it also complicated his work. Horn would eventually be hanged in 1903 for the murder of a 14-year-old boy, a killing he almost certainly did not commit, but which served the political interests of Wyoming's cattle barons. The Wild Bunch chase took Siringo across the American West and eventually to South America. In 1901, facing increasing pressure from lawmen and Pinkerton detectives, Cassidy and Sundance fled to Argentina with Sundance's companion, Etta Place. They purchased a ranch in Patagonia and attempted to live as legitimate ranchers. Siringo's investigation followed them across the ocean. He tracked their movements through ship manifests, bank records, and reports from Pinkerton operatives in South America. The pursuit became an international operation, involving cooperation between American and Argentine authorities and requiring Siringo to navigate language barriers and unfamiliar legal systems. The exact details of Siringo's time in South America are not fully documented. What is clear is that he spent months gathering evidence and attempting to coordinate capture operations in a region where the Pinkerton agency had limited resources. Cassidy and Sundance did not return to the United States. They died in Bolivia in 1908, though the circumstances of their deaths remain debated. Some sources suggest they were killed by Bolivian soldiers after a robbery. Others claim they survived and lived under assumed names. Siringo's role in bringing down the Wild Bunch was not singular. Many detectives and lawmen contributed to the pressure that eventually destroyed the gang. But his efforts prevented additional robberies and made it impossible for Cassidy and Sundance to operate freely in the United States. The 4-year pursuit demonstrated Siringo's tenacity and his willingness to subordinate personal comfort to professional objectives. It also revealed the changing nature of law enforcement. The Wild Bunch operated in an environment where mobility was their greatest advantage. Siringo and the Pinkerton agency countered with superior resources, international reach, and the ability to sustain investigations over years rather than months. In 1907, Siringo took an assignment that highlighted the moral contradictions of his work. William Haywood, a leader of the Western Federation of Miners, was on trial in Idaho for conspiracy to murder former Governor Frank Steunenberg. The case had national significance. Labor unions and mining companies were locked in violent conflict throughout the West, with bombings, shootings, and mass firings becoming common. Haywood hired Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous attorneys in America, to defend him. The Pinkerton agency, which had close ties to mining companies, assigned Siringo to protect Darrow. The assignment required Siringo to guard a man whose cause he increasingly sympathized with against threats from the very interests that employed him. Siringo had witnessed Pinkerton's strike-breaking activities and was uncomfortable with the agency's role in labor disputes. He believed workers had legitimate grievances and that corporations often used violence to suppress organizing efforts. Yet he was also a professional who took pride in completing assignments, regardless of his personal views. The tension between these positions would eventually become unsustainable. Haywood was acquitted. Darrow survived the trial unharmed, and Siringo completed his assignment successfully. But later, in 1907, he resigned from the Pinkerton agency after more than 2 decades of service. Siringo's personal life was marked by a pattern of marriage and divorce that reflected the instability of his professional career. He married Mamie Lloyd in 1884, and they had 2 children, daughter Viola, born in 1886, and son William Lee Roy, born in 1896. The marriage did not survive Siringo's long absences and the stress of detective work. After divorcing Mamie, he married Lily Thomas, then later a woman named Grace, and finally Ellen Partain. All of these marriages ended in divorce. The pattern suggests a man unable to balance domestic stability with the demands of his career, or perhaps a man fundamentally unsuited to domestic life. His children appear only briefly in available records, suggesting relationships that were strained or distant. By the time Siringo retired, he was a single man with grown children he had spent little time with, a legacy that mirrors the personal costs. Many frontier figures who prioritized adventure and career over family. After leaving Pinkerton, Siringo devoted himself to writing. He had published A Texas Cowboy in 1885, a memoir of his cattle-driving years that sold reasonably well and established him as a competent storyteller. Now he wanted to write about his detective career, to document the cases he had worked and the criminals he had pursued. In 1912, he published A Cowboy Detective. The Pinkerton Agency immediately moved to block its release. Agency lawyers argued that Siringo had signed confidentiality agreements that prohibited him from revealing details of his cases. They obtained court orders and threatened criminal prosecution. Siringo responded by changing the book's title to A Lone Star Cowboy and editing out specific names and details that Pinkerton found objectionable. The sanitized version was less satisfying to Siringo, but allowed him to avoid legal consequences while still telling his story. Siringo's most controversial work came later, a book titled Two Evil Isms, Pinkertonism and Anarchism. This manuscript directly attacked the Pinkerton Agency, exposing practices that Siringo considered corrupt and unethical. He documented voter fraud schemes where Pinkerton detectives manipulated elections on behalf of paying clients. He detailed attempts to fraudulently secure the re-election of Colorado Governor James Peabody, who had allied with mining companies against unions. He accused the agency of mass deception, of presenting false evidence in court, of protecting guilty clients while helping to convict innocent defendants. The book was explosive, and the Pinkerton Agency did everything possible to suppress it. They not only blocked its publication, but filed criminal libel charges against Siringo. The legal battle was serious enough that Siringo required protection. New Mexico Governor William McDonald, who respected Siringo's law enforcement career, provided that protection and advised him to stay out of states where Pinkerton had strong political connections. Siringo never returned to Chicago, the city where Pinkerton headquarters was located, and he spent the rest of his life understanding that powerful enemies were watching him. The suppression of two evil isms reveals the limits of free speech in early 20th century America. Corporations wielded enormous power, and private detective agencies like Pinkerton operated with minimal oversight. When Siringo attempted to expose practices he considered wrong, the agency used legal mechanisms to silence him. The criminal libel charges were particularly threatening. Unlike civil libel, which results in financial penalties, criminal libel could have sent Siringo to prison. The fact that he avoided prosecution likely reflects Governor McDonald's intervention rather than the weakness of Pinkerton's case. The experience reinforced a lesson Siringo had learned throughout his career. Telling the truth carried costs, and those costs increased when the truth challenged powerful institutions. In 1916, at age 61, Siringo joined the New Mexico Mounted Patrol. The organization tracked rustlers in the mountain and desert regions of the state. Work that required the same skills Siringo had developed as a young cowboy and refined as a Pinkerton detective. He rode through the Red Rock Plains for 2 years, pursuing cattle thieves and bringing them to justice. The work was physically demanding, and by 1918, Siringo's health was declining. He retired from active field work and moved to Hollywood, California, a city that was becoming the center of the American film industry. Hollywood was producing Western movies that romanticized the frontier Siringo had actually lived through. He found work as a consultant, advising filmmakers on authentic details of cowboy life and frontier law enforcement. It was during this period that he reconnected with Wyatt Earp, who was also living in Hollywood and also serving as a consultant to the film industry. The reunion between Siringo and Earp is notable because it brought together two men who had experienced the same historical moment from different positions. Earp had spent the decades since Tombstone cultivating his legend, giving interviews that portrayed him as the ultimate frontier lawman. Siringo had spent those same decades questioning legends and trying to document a more complex reality. Both men were now in their 70s, looking back on lives that had bridged two eras. Hollywood was interested in their stories, but primarily as raw material for entertainment rather than as historical record. The films Siringo consulted on included titles like Nine Scars, Mega Man, and Tumbleweeds. These were not major productions, and Siringo's contributions were likely minor. But the work allowed him to earn money while staying connected to the frontier culture that had defined him. In 1920, Siringo published History of Billy the Kid, a short book that recounted his 1880 pursuit of the famous outlaw. The book was part memoir and part historical analysis, offering Siringo's perspective on a figure who had been dead for nearly 40 years, but whose legend continued to grow. Siringo's account emphasized the mundane reality of the chase, the long rides, the false leads, the frustration of always arriving too late. He portrayed the kid not as a romantic rebel, but as a criminal who was skilled at evasion and benefited from a network of supporters. The book sold moderately well, appealing to readers interested in authentic frontier history rather than sensationalized fiction. Siringo's final book, Wyatt and Spurs, was published in 1927. By this point, the Pinkerton Agency had developed a systematic approach to managing Siringo's writing. Agency lawyers reviewed the manuscript before publication and demanded extensive revisions. Siringo complied. Knowing that refusal would result in legal action, he could not afford to fight. The published version of Wyatt and Spurs was heavily sanitized, with much of the factual content replaced by vague anecdotes and harmless reminiscences. Siringo recognized that the book represented a compromise with forces he had once fought against. But he was an old man with limited resources, and publication, even in compromised form, was better than suppression. The book stands as evidence of how difficult it was for frontier figures to control their own narratives once corporate interests became involved. Charles Siringo died on October 18, 1928, in Altadena, California. He was 73 years old. He died alone, without family present, in circumstances that suggest financial difficulty and social isolation. There was no large funeral, no public recognition of his passing by the institutions he had served. Newspapers ran brief obituaries noting his career as a cowboy and detective, but offering little analysis of his significance. In death, as in life, Siringo occupied an ambiguous position, too critical of authority to be celebrated by those in power, too compromised by his association with Pinkerton to be embraced by those who opposed corporate power. The question of what Charles Siringo's life reveals about the American West requires separating documented evidence from attractive mythology. The evidence shows a man who lived through a period of rapid transformation, from a frontier economy based on open-range cattle driving to an industrial economy based on corporate control of resources. It shows a man who developed valuable skills in one era and successfully adapted them to the next. It shows a man capable of significant physical courage and endurance, who spent years pursuing dangerous criminals across vast distances. It shows a man who became increasingly uncomfortable with the moral compromises his work required, particularly when that work involved suppressing labor organizing or protecting corporate interest at the expense of workers. And it shows a man who tried, in the final decades of his life, to tell his truth despite facing legal and financial threats from powerful enemies. What the evidence does not show is a simple hero or a purely virtuous figure. Siringo worked for an agency that engaged in union busting and political manipulation. He participated in operations designed to protect corporate property rather than serve justice. His personal life was marked by failed marriages and distant relationships with his children, suggesting a man who prioritized career over family or who was simply unable to maintain domestic stability. His writings were sometimes self-serving, exaggerating his own role while minimizing the contributions of others. The famous Clay Allison incident is instructive. Siringo's version contradicted Wyatt Earp's account, but we have no way to determine which version was accurate. Both men had reasons to shape the story to their advantage. The mythology of the gunfighter emphasizes individual action, dramatic confrontations, and clear moral lines. The reality of frontier law enforcement was bureaucratic, repetitive, and morally ambiguous. Siringo spent years filling out reports, tracking expenses, coordinating with local lawmen, and waiting for opportunities that often never materialized. His pursuit of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid involved far more tedious investigation than dramatic confrontation. His role in bringing down the Wild Bunch was part of a larger institutional effort that included dozens of detectives, local sheriffs, railroad security forces, and international law enforcement agencies. Reducing this complex operation to a story of one man's heroism distorts what actually happened and obscures the institutional mechanisms that were replacing frontier justice with corporate security. The transformation that Siringo's career represents, from open-range cowboy to corporate detective, parallels the broader transformation of the American West. The skills that made Siringo effective as a cowboy translated directly to detective work. His ability to read terrain became an ability to read situations. His endurance on cattle drives became endurance during long investigations. His leadership of ranch hands became leadership of other detectives. But the context changed fundamentally. As a cowboy, Siringo worked within an economy where individual initiative and direct action produced results. As a detective, he worked within a corporate bureaucracy where success depended on following procedures and serving client interests. The transition was not clean, and Siringo's discomfort with aspects of his later career reflects genuine moral conflicts between frontier values and corporate demands. The limits of available evidence must be acknowledged. Many details of Siringo's life are not documented in surviving records. His movements during specific periods can be reconstructed only partially. His relationships with family members remain largely opaque. His time in South America pursuing Cassidy and Sundance is documented through scattered reports rather than comprehensive accounts. Some of his claims about specific cases cannot be verified through independent sources. This does not mean Siringo was lying, but it does mean that any account of his life must include uncertainty. The temptation to fill gaps with speculation or to accept his self-presentation uncritically must be resisted. What we can say with confidence is limited but still substantial. The immediate consequences of Siringo's career were modest. He helped capture criminals who would otherwise have continued stealing and occasionally killing. He provided security services that benefited corporations while sometimes harming workers. He wrote books that documented frontier life from the perspective of someone who had actually lived it, though those books were censored and suppressed when they challenged powerful interests. He died without wealth or wide recognition, and within a few years most people had forgotten his name. But the long-term legacy is more complex. Siringo's writings, even in their compromised form, provided historians with detailed accounts of frontier law enforcement that challenged romanticized narratives. His legal battles with the Pinkerton Agency revealed the extent to which corporations controlled information in the early 20th century. His evolution from frontier lawman to critic of corporate power anticipated later debates about the relationship between private security and public justice. The question of whether Siringo was a hero requires defining what heroism means in this context. If heroism requires moral purity and consistent adherence to ethical principles, then Siringo fails the test. He worked for an agency that committed acts he later condemned. He prioritized career over family. He sometimes exaggerated his own importance. But if heroism can include moral complexity, if it can accommodate a person who made compromises but ultimately tried to tell the truth even at personal cost, then Siringo's claim to heroic status becomes stronger. His final years were spent fighting censorship and trying to document a reality that contradicted profitable myths. He died alone and largely forgotten, sacrifices that suggest he valued truth-telling more than comfort or recognition. The preservation of frontier history depends on sources like Siringo's writings because they complicate easy narratives. Popular culture prefers clear heroes and villains, dramatic showdowns, and morally unambiguous outcomes. The historical record reveals something messier: men who moved between legitimate and illegitimate work, law enforcement agencies that served private interests, violence that was often mundane rather than mythic, and a transformation from frontier to industrial society that destroyed as much as it created. Siringo's value as a historical source lies precisely in his willingness to document this complexity, even when doing so made powerful enemies and cost him opportunities for recognition and profit. On October 18, 1928, an old man died in Altadena, California. 73 years earlier, a baby had been born on the Matagorda Peninsula in Texas to an Italian immigrant and his Irish wife. Between those two dates lies a life that encompassed the transformation of the American West from frontier to settled region, from a place where individual courage and initiative could determine outcomes to a place where corporate power and bureaucratic procedure governed behavior. Charles Angelo Siringo drove cattle up the Chisholm Trail when that work was vital to the regional economy. He pursued Billy the Kid when the kid was still alive and dangerous rather than a legend. He spent 4 years hunting Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid across 2 continents. He protected Clarence Darrow during a trial that revealed the violence underlying labor disputes. He fought the Pinkerton Agency when it tried to suppress his memoirs. He died alone, having outlived his era and most of the men he had known. The temptation is to conclude with a summary judgment, to declare whether Siringo's life was ultimately heroic or tragic, whether his compromises were justified or fatal to his moral standing. But the historical record resists such certainties. What remains is a documented life of unusual complexity, a career that intersected with virtually every major figure and event of the late frontier period, and a legacy of writing that continues to challenge popular myths about the Wild West. Siringo was a cowboy who became a detective, a company man who became a critic, a participant in frontier mythology who ended his life trying to document frontier reality. He was neither purely heroic nor purely compromised, but rather a product of his specific historical moment who responded to that moment with intelligence, courage, and increasing moral clarity. The Matagorda Peninsula, where he was born, has changed beyond recognition. The cattle trails are gone. The frontier towns have become cities or disappeared entirely. But the questions Siringo's life raises about justice, loyalty, truth-telling, and the relationship between individual action and institutional power remain urgent. In that sense, the cowboy detective story is not finished, but continues in every debate about how we understand our past and what lessons we draw from it.